Imagine driving home in a storm, headlights slicing through sheets of rain when a flash of movement in a broken wheelchair stops you cold. Your ex-wife, paralyzed, soaked to the bone, holding your twin babies as they shiver and cry, sits on the curb while umbrellas slap past like she's air. No one stops, no one sees. That sight tears something open inside you. The guilt, the excuses, the years you walked away. And then, only then, you realize how deep her suffering went, and how easily you turned your back. Today's story starts there, on that street, with that moment that should have changed everything but instead shattered him in ways wealth, pride, or regret never could. Stay with me, because at the end you'll be questioning what loyalty and love really cost. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Sarah before the wheelchair? Before the rain, before the hunger, before the world passed her by as if she no longer existed? To understand the night Michael saw her again, you need to understand the woman she used to be. The voice that lifted her small community on Sundays. The girl whose laughter made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. The wife who believed that marriage meant forever. And why did Michael walk away when she needed him most? He had made promises in front of friends, family, even God himself. And yet when tragedy came crashing down, when Sarah's body was broken by a birth that brought life and pain at the same time, Michael chose the door instead of the fight. And what did he learn the night he saw her again, broken but not beaten with twin babies in her arms? That is the question that will haunt you until the very end. Because this is not just Sarah's story. It's a test of loyalty, of courage, and of what it truly means to stay. Before the wheelchair, before the rain, before the silence of strangers rushing past without seeing her, Sarah Miller was a voice that carried hope. In a modest church on the edge of Houston's suburbs, her singing filled the air each Sunday morning like sunlight through stained glass. People who came in tired left with tears in their eyes. The older women whispered that she had a gift, a sound that touched the heart. The younger girls looked up to her, believing that if Sarah could sing with such conviction, maybe they too could find strength in their own lives. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, but she was loved, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her unforgettable. Even as she worked simple jobs during the week to make ends meet, Sarah's faith and her song made her feel rich in ways that money could not measure. It was in that same church that she met Michael Miller. He was ambitious, charming, always quick with a laugh and a handshake. To the congregation, he was a young man with drive, a man who dreamed of building something bigger than himself. And to Sarah, he was a promise of partnership, someone who seemed ready to stand with her through life's storms. Their wedding was simple but filled with joy. A rented hall, family crowded close, neighbors who clapped until their palms stung. Sarah wore a gown borrowed from a cousin. Michael wore a suit that he had saved months to buy. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and in that moment it felt like enough. When the pastor asked Michael if he would protect her, he answered so firmly that everyone believed him. Sarah believed him most of all. And as they left the church that day, hand in hand, they whispered about the future they would build. When Sarah discovered she was expecting, the news alone would have been enough to fill their small apartment with joy. But then came the doctor's words. Not one heartbeat, but two. Twin girls. For Sarah, it was a blessing she could hardly comprehend. For Michael, it was proof, he said, that their union was favored. He told friends at work that he had been given double blessings, and when his friends asked if he was afraid of the responsibility, he shook his head and said the words that still echo like a cruel reminder. I'll never let my family suffer. Sarah clung to that sentence. She repeated it to herself when the bills stacked up, when her back ached under the weight of carrying two lives, when she was too tired to sing at church but pushed through anyway. Michael was her anchor then. Or at least that's what she thought. Houston summers are unforgiving, and yet Sarah glowed through her pregnancy. She walked slowly, but always with a hand resting protectively on her growing belly. The congregation cheered her on, some bringing small gifts for the babies, others promising to help when the girls arrived. At night, in their tiny kitchen, Sarah and Michael debated names. She liked Emily and Grace, names that spoke of gentleness and resilience. He agreed, saying those names sounded like destiny. To the outside world, they looked like a couple ready to face anything together. But in the quiet moments, Sarah noticed the way Michael's eyes sometimes drifted, calculating the weight of responsibility more than the joy of it. She saw how his smile tightened when bills arrived in the mail. She prayed over him, believing his heart would be steady. She didn't know yet how fragile his resolve truly was. The day Sarah went into labor began with excitement. She had carried Emily and Grace for 9 long months, her back aching, her body weary, but her spirit steady. Michael drove her to the hospital, his hands tight on the wheel, his voice a mix of fear and anticipation. They had talked about this moment for weeks. He promised her he would be there every second, that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone. The waiting room was crowded, the halls buzzing with nurses rushing in and out, but Sarah only focused on the thought of finally holding her girls. Hours turned into the hardest night of her life. Her body shook with pain, the room filled with her cries, the voices of doctors urging her to push, the cries of newborns echoing faintly down the corridor. When Emily's first cry filled the air, Sarah sobbed with relief. Seconds later, Grace followed. 2 perfect girls. But while the babies cried with life, Sarah's own body began to fail her. The doctors noticed something was wrong almost immediately. The labor had taken too long, the strain too severe. Sarah's legs felt heavy, numb, unresponsive. She tried to move them, but nothing happened. Fear flooded her as a doctor pulled Michael aside in hushed tones. The explanation was clinical but devastating. Her spinal cord had been injured during the delivery. She might never walk again. Michael's face fell. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had landed on him in one sentence. When he returned to Sarah's bedside, he forced a smile. He kissed her forehead, held her hand, whispered words she wanted to believe. "You're strong. I'm right here. I'll never leave you." And for a moment, Sarah's heart clung to that promise, unaware of the decision forming in his mind, a decision that would rewrite the rest of her life. At 2 a.m., Sarah finally drifted into a fitful sleep, the twins swaddled beside her. Michael stood by the doorway, silent. His mind raced through fears he couldn't control: hospital bills, a disabled wife, 2 crying babies, a life he hadn't prepared for. In that silence, he made a choice. He leaned down, kissed her forehead again, and whispered the same words one last time. Then he said quietly, "I'll be right back." Sarah, exhausted, nodded, trusting him completely. But Michael didn't walk to the cafeteria or the nursery. He walked out of the hospital doors, and he never came back. His footsteps faded into the rain outside, leaving behind the sound of 2 infants whimpering and a woman who would wake up to an empty chair where her husband should have been. The morning came with the cries of Emily and Grace echoing in the small room. Sarah reached for Michael, but his side of the bed was cold. She asked a nurse who said he had stepped out hours ago. Minutes turned into hours, hours into a day. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed his number. No answer. She typed a message. Delivered. Read. No reply. She tried again. More messages. More silence. In desperation, she sent voice notes, her voice trembling. "Please, Michael. The babies need you. Don't do this. Please come back." She sent messages to their church group. The blue ticks appeared, but no one responded. Friends who once cheered their wedding now stayed silent. Family who once promised to help turned their phones off. Alone in that hospital room, Sarah realized the truth. She had been left. Not with a goodbye, not with an explanation, just silence. When the fire gets hot, not every man stays in the kitchen. When the hospital finally discharged Sarah, it wasn't with flowers or joyful songs, but with a stack of papers and bills she had no way of paying. Emily and Grace were tiny, fragile, and always hungry. Sarah's body was weak, her legs still unmoving, her spirit wavering but not broken. Nurses wheeled her out to the entrance and placed her into the hands of her best friend, Angela. Angela had known Sarah since high school, a friend who had always been by her side during choir rehearsals and long walks home after church. Angela lived in a one-room apartment in a quiet part of Houston. She didn't have much, but she had a heart big enough to carry someone else's burden. She made space for Sarah's wheelchair, made a corner for the babies, and promised her, "We'll get through this together." For a while, that promise carried them both. Days turned into weeks, and reality pressed harder with each passing sunrise. Diapers disappeared faster than Angela could afford to buy them. Milk cans emptied long before there was money to replace them. The rent notice came, red letters stamped across the page, reminding them of how fragile their shelter really was. Angela tried to smile for Sarah, tried to stretch her little business braiding hair, but exhaustion lined her face. At night, Sarah would hear her sighing quietly, sometimes crying softly when she thought no one was listening. Sarah wanted to help, but she could not walk, could not work, could not do much more than hold her babies close and whisper prayers into the night. Emily and Grace cried often, their tiny voices cutting through the silence of that cramped apartment. And though Angela rocked them and sang lullabies when Sarah was too tired, both women knew the walls were closing in. One evening, Angela came home later than usual, her shoulders slumped, her hands empty. She set down her bag and sat across from Sarah, her face pale. For a long time she said nothing, then finally whispered, "I can't do this anymore." Sarah froze, her heart tightening. Angela's eyes filled with tears as she explained, "I've tried, I've given everything, but I'm drowning. The rent is late, the landlord is threatening, and I have no more strength. You and the babies need more than I can give, I'm just one person." Sarah didn't cry, though inside she was shattering. Instead, she reached across and took Angela's hand. In a quiet voice, she said, Thank you for keeping us this long. If this is the end, I understand." Those words broke Angela even more. She had hoped Sarah would argue, hoped she would demand, but instead Sarah showed gratitude even in abandonment. That night, both women sat in silence, the sound of Emily and Grace breathing the only thing filling the air. The next morning, Sarah dressed the twins in the only clean clothes they had left. She wrapped them together in a worn blanket, strapped her small handbag to the back of her wheelchair, and kissed Angela on the cheek. Angela wept as she wheeled her to the door, apologizing again and again, but Sarah only smiled weakly. "You gave me shelter," she whispered. "That's more than anyone else did." Then she pushed herself out onto the street, the weight of two babies pressing against her chest, her wheelchair creaking beneath her. She had no plan, no destination, no money, and nowhere safe to go. She found a busy corner where cars roared past, where people in suits hurried by, where life moved fast and no one looked twice at a stranger. There she stopped. She set a piece of cardboard on her lap, scrawled with trembling hands, "Please help. My babies are hungry." And then she waited. The hours passed slowly. The sun beat down, burning her skin, but Sarah did not move. Emily whimpered. Grace coughed. Her arms ached from holding them, but she pulled them closer and whispered, "Hold on, my loves. Hold on." Strangers glanced, then looked away. Some whispered prayers under their breath but kept walking. By late afternoon, the clouds gathered, thick and heavy. Thunder rolled low in the distance. The sky darkened, and the first drop of rain fell across Sarah's face. She tilted her head upward, too tired to move, and let it soak her hair. Soon the storm unleashed itself. Rain pounded the pavement, soaked her dress, and turned the cardboard sign into a dripping mess of smeared charcoal. Emily and Grace cried softly, their tiny hands clinging to her shirt. But Sarah could not leave. She had nowhere left to go. And so she stayed, in the middle of that storm, drenched, trembling, yet refusing to let go of the children pressed against her heart. And that's where Michael, now remarried, successful and proud, saw her again. Life had not gone as Michael expected. After leaving Sarah in that hospital, he remarried quickly, convincing himself that he was building a new chapter, one free of responsibility he claimed he could not carry. For a while, it looked as though he had chosen well. His new wife was glamorous, social, and eager to spend the money he worked so hard to earn. They traveled, they attended events, and Michael wore the mask of success. But behind the curtain, cracks formed. His wife drained his accounts with luxury purchases, promises of investments that never existed, and constant demands that left him exhausted. When she finally left, she did not leave quietly. She emptied what little savings he had, walked out with his car keys, and left him with nothing more than unpaid bills and a reputation that was crumbling. Michael, once proud and ambitious, found himself alone, spiraling, searching for meaning in a life that seemed to mock him at every turn. It was during this decline that Michael found himself in Houston again, driving through the familiar streets that now felt heavier than before. He was on a business trip, trying to claw back his dignity, telling himself he could still rebuild. Rain fell hard that evening, streaking the glass of his sedan, drowning out the noise of the radio. He sat in the back seat, scrolling through his phone, ignoring the storm outside. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. Sarah. Soaked, motionless in a battered wheelchair, with Emily and Grace pressed against her chest. The sight jolted him like lightning. His first thought was disbelief. It couldn't be her. The second was shame, a memory of the hospital, of the promises he made and broke. And the third was denial, because facing her now meant facing the man he had become. He asked the driver to stop. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Michael stepped out into the rain, his shoes splashing against the flooded pavement. People hurried by, shielding themselves with umbrellas, but his eyes never left Sarah. She looked thinner, older, but her eyes were the same, deep, tired, and full of a strength he did not remember. He walked toward her slowly, unsure of what to say, unsure if she would even recognize him. When their eyes finally met, Sarah did not flinch. She did not cry out or call his name. She only tightened her grip on Emily and Grace, lifting her chin against the rain. Michael opened his mouth, searching for words. At last, all he managed was, "Sarah, But his voice faltered, swallowed by the storm. He wanted to explain, to justify, to paint his leaving as something other than cowardice. But the truth hung between them like a weight too heavy to deny. But Sarah didn't just survive the rain. She became the storm. She looked at him with eyes that no longer pleaded, no longer begged. In a voice steady despite the cold, she said the words that broke him more than any silence could. "You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from them." She nodded toward the twins, their tiny hands clinging to her dress, their faces marked by hunger but also by resilience. Michael staggered back as if struck. He tried to speak again, muttering apologies, blaming circumstances, insisting he had been young and overwhelmed. But Sarah shook her head slowly, her expression calm, unshaken. "You made a choice," she told him. "And I made mine. You left, but I chose to stay. I chose to fight for them, even when I couldn't stand. I am not broken, Michael. I am their mother, and that is more than you will ever be to them." The revelation that followed was not one Michael expected, for as he stood there, stammering in the storm, another car pulled up to the curb. From it stepped a man Sarah introduced with quiet respect. A wealthy benefactor, someone she had met through a local outreach program, who had seen her struggle and decided she was worth saving. He had paid for her medical care, arranged therapy, and placed her in a home where she and the twins could heal. Under his support, Sarah had begun to recover, learning to walk again step by painful step. This stranger had done what Michael had promised but failed to deliver. Michael realized with crushing certainty that he was too late. Sarah had found strength not in him, but in spite of him. She had been lifted, not by his hand, but by the hand of someone who truly saw her. Years passed, but the memory of that storm never left Sarah. The day Michael saw her on the street was not the end of her story. It was the turning point. With the help of her benefactor and her own relentless will, Sarah entered months of therapy, her body aching as she fought to move muscles that had been silent for too long. There were days she wanted to give up, but Emily and Grace were always watching. Each painful step became a lesson for her daughters that strength was not about never falling, but about rising every time you did. Slowly, she learned to stand again, then to take one step, then another. And in time, she no longer needed the wheelchair. She stood tall, carrying not just her own weight, but the weight of every promise she made to herself and her children. Out of pain, she built purpose. Dallas, Texas, a bright morning. A new building stood at the heart of the city, glass doors reflecting the sun, banners waving in the breeze. It was the grand opening of the Sarah Grace Center, a foundation designed to shelter disabled mothers, to give them food, training, and most importantly, hope. Inside, the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Media cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and women from across the state gathered, some in wheelchairs, some with children, all drawn by the story of one woman who refused to be forgotten. Then the room hushed as Sarah appeared. No chair, no walker, no cane. She walked unassisted onto the stage, her dress a soft shade of blue, her hair pulled back simply, her face radiant with quiet strength. On either side of her stood Emily and Grace, now school-aged, their smiles wide as they clutched her hands. The applause erupted like thunder, but Sarah's eyes filled with tears not for herself, but for them. In the third row, hidden behind sunglasses and a lowered head, sat Michael. His life had unraveled. The woman he remarried had taken everything and left him hollow. His attempts to rebuild failed. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow of the man who once walked away, and as he sat there watching Sarah speak, he understood the depth of what he had lost. This was the family he abandoned. This was the woman he left in the rain. And yet, she had risen higher than he could ever have imagined. Her voice was steady as she told the audience, "Years ago I thought my story ended when I lost my legs and my husband walked away. But it was only the beginning. Out of that pain came strength, and from that strength came this center. This place is for every mother who has been told her life is over. You are not finished. You are just beginning." He thought leaving her made him free, but what he lost was the only thing money could never buy: dignity, family, redemption. The cameras captured every word. The crowd rose to their feet. Emily and Grace clapped the loudest, proud of the woman they called mother, proud of the legacy she was building in their names. And in the shadows of the auditorium, Michael lowered his head, destroyed not by anger but by the truth. The life he once ran from had become a legacy without him. He realized that Sarah had taken the storm he left her in and turned it into a beacon for others. And as the choir swelled in the background, as the applause shook the walls of the Sarah Grace Center, Michael finally understood what it meant to lose everything. Not wealth, not status, but the love of a woman who chose to fight when he chose to run. And that loss would haunt him for the rest of his days. The story of Sarah Miller and Michael Miller does not end with the storm, nor with the opening of the Sarah Grace Center. It ends here, with a question that lingers long after the applause fades. Because stories like these are not just about one woman or one man, they are about choices. Choices that define who we are and who we become. Michael made his choice the night he whispered, "I'll be right back," and never returned. Sarah made hers the morning she rolled into the rain, unwilling to surrender her children even if the world had already surrendered her. Two choices, two paths, two legacies that could not be more different. And now the question rests with you. If you were Sarah, would you have forgiven him? Or walked away like she did? Would you have opened your arms to the man who abandoned you at your weakest? Or would you have done as Sarah did and closed the door forever? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters here because this is more than a story. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask not only what we would have done, but who we truly are when loyalty and love are tested. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear about the wife who showed up at her own funeral. Yes, you heard that right. A man laid his wife to rest, only to discover that the grave was empty, and the truth waiting at his doorstep was stranger than anything he could have imagined. That is a story you do not want to miss, and it's coming next. Subscribe for more stories that make you question everything you thought you knew. Because life does not always unfold the way we expect. Sometimes it breaks us. Sometimes it remakes us. And sometimes, like Sarah, it reminds us that strength is not about standing tall when the skies are clear. It is about rising again after the storm.